Thank you, Joe. Now, we're going to need some audience participation to get this sermon started. So here's the first question. How many of you ever played football in your life? I know a couple guys did. Okay. Now, for those of you, Sandy? Oh, okay. Wow, that's impressive. So, for those of you who played football, what is the most demanding position on the football field? Center, halfback. What do you think, Mitchell? Quarterback. Mark, coach, wide receiver. You guys are all over the place here. How about the kicker? Anybody think the kicker? No. Listen, when you listen to a football game, I am anyway, I'm concerned about the quarterback, I'm concerned about the running back, I'm worried about these big pass plays that they're making. But if you listen to analysts, and I'm sure if we ask you guys who played football, you'll say definitely, where's the game won or lost? Exactly. Bill, you did it. It's your Gottman. It's won or lost in the line, right? And is the offense, especially the offensive line, or is that a glamorous position to play? Now, do you ever hear those guys' names mentioned? When do you hear them mentioned? If they let some guy through and the quarterback gets sacked, if they make a mistake, right? They're an inglorious position. And what do those guys do for most of the game? What are they doing? Bill, we'll ask you since you've been right here. Lay it on the ground? No. They're beating each other up. They're wrestling. They're fighting with one another. This offensive line goes against the defense, and their job is to stop them from getting to the quarterback. Most of the game, if you watch it, the offensive line, they're just struggling body on body. They're wrestling, right? They're just struggling. And in good games, the offense will kind of gain ground, right? If the offense is doing well, the offensive line will push their way forward, right? In bad games, what happens is the other way. The defensive line pushes back, and the offensive guys, there they are, laying on the ground, as Joe said. But in most situations, there's not really this give and take so much. It's kind of they're just steady, right? They're making a pocket for the quarterback. They're not really going forward. They're not really going back. They're just kind of in one position, wrestling with another man, trying to keep him off the quarterback. Fair assessment for those of you who played football? Pretty fair assessment, right? Now, I think in our lives, if we were to compare ourselves to a position on the football field, we would compare ourselves probably most to an offensive lineman. Because how does life go? Most of the time you're not in the quarterback position, right? Most of the time you're not this speedy wide receiver. Most of the time in our life, we are just kind of struggling, right? We face these difficult times in our lives. We don't make any ground. Nothing comes against us. We just kind of are fighting and wrestling with life. I mean, we talked about last week how Jacob kind of did this throughout his life. Remember, he had this trouble with his brother. He had this trouble with Laban. He's just kind of, at this point in his life, trying to get by. He's really had a tough life. He's struggled through life. Life can be a battle, a struggle, a wrestling match, or if you will, kind of like you're on the offensive line fighting. But did you ever consider that might be what your relationship with God is like? A struggle, a battle, a wrestling match? Our relationship with God as a wrestling match kind of goes against what we think. Most of us think that our relationship with God is, what, a friendship, right? He walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. Or maybe as Father God, and we are his children, right? Or perhaps even we are servants, he is the master. We kind of think in those terms with our relationship with God, and those are good terms to think in. But what I want to challenge you to think about today is your relationship with God, not in those terms, but as a wrestling match, as a struggle, as a battle. It's what happened to Jacob that night as he wrestled. The Scripture sets this ominous scene. Jacob sends everything else across the river, all his possessions, all his family, and he's left there alone, by himself. And this is really strange that Jacob wouldn't go to the other side of the river with his family. What did he need on this side of the river? Nothing. He didn't need to be there, but we're told that he was left there. Maybe it got dark and Jacob couldn't make it back across the river. Maybe kind of the river did this current thing where it was too strong for Jacob to get across once he came back. I don't know why Jacob was left alone, but Jacob was left alone. And in the midst of the night, as Jacob was there alone, a man came and he wrestled with Jacob. Also kind of strange. We're not told why the man came. We're not told how the man got to Jacob. We're not told why they started wrestling even. But a man came and Jacob wrestled with him all night long. And the battle, much like the offensive line, was a stalemate. No one was winning. No one was losing. They were deadlocked. They wrestled for hours, but they were deadlocked. But Jacob didn't realize it at the time, but the man he was wrestling with had this big advantage over him. See, it was not just any man Jacob was wrestling with. It was God in the flesh. So let's be clear here. The men were deadlocked not because God couldn't win, but because God chose to continue to wrestle with Jacob. And as the battle went on, day began to break. And as day began to break, the time for the battle to be over had come. So God just reached down, used his advantage, hit Jacob in the hip, and wrenched his hip out of socket. How many of you ever watched a wrestling match? Not like the fake wrestling we watch on TV, but like a high school or college wrestling match. Anybody? Anybody want to guess what the most painful injury would be? The hip, from what I've read. If you wrench your hip out of socket, it is painful. I've never done it, but I know my wife, not in a wrestling match, but has had her hip come out of socket, and it is painful. It is painful. But Jacob, though his hip was wrenched out of socket, though it was probably killing him, what did he do? He held on to the man for dear life. He just wouldn't give up. Now, if my hip was wrenched out of socket, probably if the guy took one of my fingers and bent it back, I would have said, Uncle, all right, that's it, I'm done. You win. Not Jacob, though. Jacob was hanging on to this man, and we're told he was hanging on to this man because he wanted to be blessed. Now, here's the first clue we have, that Jacob somehow in the middle of the night, maybe when his hip just kind of wrenched out of socket, Jacob realized he was wrestling with God. But he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't give in. It's a little hard to comprehend, but Jacob continues to wrestle and to struggle. And eventually, Jacob asks for the blessing, and God says to Jacob, not that he's going to be blessed right away, but he says, what's your name? Now, God knew Jacob's name. But he wanted Jacob to be reminded of who he was. You know what Jacob means? It means grasp the heel, which is kind of a saying that means the deceiver. Remember who Jacob was. All his life, he was out for himself. He was deceiving others to get what he wanted. Remember, he tried that kind of thing with Esau, and then even he did it a little bit with Laban, with the whole animal husbandry thing. Jacob was a deceiver, and God says, who are you? And Jacob says, I'm the deceiver. And God looks at him and he says, no. That's not your name anymore. Your name now is Israel. He who strives with God. And God explains that his name has been changed because he has striven with man and God, and he has overcome. What God is basically saying to Jacob is the same thing he said to Abraham and the same thing he said to Saul in the New Testament. He's saying, this is it. Your old life is over. Your new life has begun. Jacob, you are no longer a deceiver. Your time as a deceiver is done. Get over it and move forward. And then he blesses him. But before that, Jacob, in kind of a foolish mindset, says, "Who are you that I'm wrestling with?" And God basically says to him, "You know who I am. I'm God. You know who I am, Jacob." But then he is blessed. Now, this event has made a big impression on Jacob. It's made a big impression in two ways. First way it made an impression, his hip. He limped for the rest of his life. Jacob would remember the event because it affected him physically. But Jacob remembered the event, and we know it made a big impression on him because he names the place Peniel or Peniel, which means face of God. And Jacob says, "Boy, I'm lucky. I have seen the face of God and lived." Now let's get something clear here. Have any of you wrestled with God in the flesh? If you have, we've got to tell your story. But it is unlikely that tonight you will be left alone and you're going to meet God in hand-to-hand combat. It probably, I would say 99% sure, that is not going to happen when you go home tonight. If you're left alone in the woods, you may meet a bear, but you're not going to meet God in the flesh. It's very doubtful. So what does all this have to do with us? Well, think about it. Wrestling with God. How do we meet God today? We don't meet him so much in the flesh. We meet him in the spirit through prayer. Our struggles, our wrestles with God happen in prayer. But here's the problems we run into with our struggling with God or our lack thereof. The problem number one that we face is we don't get close enough to God to struggle with him in prayer. You know how close Jacob and God had to be there to wrestle? They couldn't be like 50 feet away. They couldn't be 20 feet away. They were nose to nose. Their bodies were against each other. They were so close that probably when sweat dripped off one, it landed on the other. They had a close relationship at that time. They were close to one another. I think our first problem with our relationship with God is that we never get close enough to God to struggle with him. We keep our relationship with God to kind of this superficial thing. We need our own personal space, and we don't want God to get involved in it. We'll go to church because that's superficial enough. We don't really, truly have to meet God if we don't want to. We'll go to a Bible study, and we'll kind of stay on the edge of a Bible study because we don't want to get too close to God. And then when we pray, we'll kind of make sure we get it done real quick because we don't get close enough to God. That's problem number one with our prayer life. We don't get close enough to God. Problem number two is that if we do get close enough, we don't spend enough honest time in prayer. Jacob wrestled with the man all night long. He didn't give up after 10 minutes. He didn't give up after 15 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. He wrestled with him all night long. Sometimes we think our prayer life is kind of like, well, if we say our 15 minutes at the beginning of the day and we say our 15 minutes at the end of the day, then that's enough. And guess what? As I say that, I'm making myself guilty of that offense as well. None of us spend enough honest time in prayer. When we have struggles in our lives, when we have difficulties in our lives, the first thing we should do is hit our knees and talk to God in prayer. Our prayer lives. Sometimes we don't spend enough honest time in prayer. And number three, we forget what prayer is designed to do. See, prayer is communication with God. But sometimes prayer is also seen as struggling or wrestling. Let me give you two examples. They're from the New Testament, don't worry. Here's the first example. Paul tells us that we don't struggle against physical things. We struggle against spiritual enemies and difficulties. The stuff that's going wrong in your life, the people that mistreat you, all those kind of things, they're physical things. But you know what the root cause of problems are? It's sin, and it's Satan. And he is a spiritual enemy. And we don't win spiritual battles in the physical realm. It just doesn't happen. We win them in the spiritual realm. And you know what our weapon is? It is prayer. We struggle against the difficulties in our lives through prayer. That's one form of struggle that prayer is. And number two, the second example is Jesus. Remember Jesus, right before he died, he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's praying to God, right? And what kind of prayer does Jesus say to God in the Garden of Gethsemane? Oh, hi, God, how are you? Oh, things are so wonderful, God. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be. No. Jesus is in a deep and meaningful struggle with God. He's saying, God, my Father, if this cup can be passed from me, let it be so. And you know how meaningful and how deep his struggle is? What's the Bible tell us? Drops of blood are coming out of his forehead. He's struggling so much. Do you have a spiritual struggle? Wrestle with it and use prayer as your weapon. Do you just struggle with what's going on in your life? Are you upset and angry with what God's doing? Do you have a problem with something God says in his word? Or are you struggling with the decision that you're about to make? Then guess what? Go to God in prayer and struggle with it and wrestle with it and take your time and don't just give in at the first sign of defeat. Wait, struggle, keep going. Be persistent. Remember the story of the widow in the New Testament? She's so persistent that eventually the judge gives in. We need to be persistent in our prayer lives. Prayer should be an honest struggle. When we struggle with God in prayer, a bunch of different things happen. Most importantly, we draw closer to God. If you want God to be close to you, the Bible is real clear. You got to draw near to him. And as your relationship with God grows, guess what? There's going to be struggles, and there's going to be things that you don't quite understand. It happens. That's when you need to struggle with God in prayer. And as you struggle with God in prayer, a couple things are going to happen. The struggle is going to make you stronger. It's going to strengthen your faith because you're closer to God. Number two, the struggle is going to change you. You're going to leave the struggle in prayer with a different perspective because prayer doesn't change the mind of God. It changes us. And it conforms us to the will of God. So you're going to leave the struggle different. And you know what? Sometimes it may be painful. Jacob left that struggle with God, different man. But he had the limp to prove it. Physical struggles, like the one that Jacob had with God, caused Jacob to trust God and to rely on him more and more. And when we struggle in prayer, the same thing will happen. We'll begin to know God more, and we'll begin to trust him more. As you watch the struggle that goes on in the trenches, either this week in the Pro Bowl or next week in the Super Bowl, just kind of look at the offensive linemen for a moment. Don't get caught up in the running back or the quarterback or the wide receivers, though it's real easy to do so. Just watch those guys. Watch them struggle and battle for position. And as you do so, remember, we should be willing to struggle like that in prayer.